around this time of the year, so kind of May, June 1997, we were finishing up making GoldenEye. The purpose of talking to you today is to give you a bit of an insight into that. It's quite strange to find myself still talking about it, or people wanting me to talk about it, such a long time afterwards, because certainly when we were making it, I think our expectation of what the game would be or the impact that it might have was probably quite different to what it ended up being. Certainly didn't expect it to be something that would be so fondly remembered or to touch so many people. Okay, so GoldenEye, the development of GoldenEye. The interesting thing about Bond is it's an enormous franchise. You know, when I was growing up in Northern Ireland, this is actually me contemplating world domination or something at quite an early age. I would have known at that age. I knew who Bond was. You know, it was a thing that even in the days before kind of on-demand entertainment, and even if you didn't go to the cinema a lot, you waited every year. It was like come around Christmas time or something, and Goldfinger would be on, and it would be you wouldn't miss it. You'd circle it on the Radio Times or whatever, and you'd make sure you watched it because it was such a kind of a thing that everyone knew about. And then for me, I think particularly of my generation, I mean, people kind of say kind of you can date yourself by who Bond was for you. I mean, it's fairly tragic that Roger Moore has just died, but for me, this was Bond. To go back to my youth, everyone who was anyone had one of these, which is the Aston Martin DB5 from Goldfinger. This is the corgi toy. Everyone had one of these. Not many people managed to keep hold of the little guy from the ejector seat because he would get fired out and go under the sofa or get eaten by the dog or something. Interesting, the Bond franchise, I mean, in terms of global worth of franchises, in Bond, I think currently it was, well, a few years ago, it was valued kind of, I don't know, 16, 20 million or $20 billion. That's comparable to the big franchises now of, say, Star Wars or Harry Potter and things. But even before something like Star Wars was doing merchandising, Bond was a thing which was quite heavily merchandised and had a visibility outside of the cinema. In terms of video games, that's an interesting thing because video games certainly almost like before GoldenEye, video games were kind of an afterthought. It was some part of the residual back end of the marketing for the game or for the film, which wasn't expected to be any good. As I say, I grew up with this guy as Bond, and I was kind of looking through my back catalogue for things that would validate my involvement in Bond things. And I think there's a certain likeness. This is me. I don't know, like a little rabbit caught in the headlights, about to go to a prom at school. But you know, it's definitely there's a link. There's a link in there somewhere. Okay, so in GoldenEye, I kind of famously ended up being Dr. Doak. This is just another thing to show my credentials. So this is from a few years later. So I am actually a real doctor. And this is what I used to do before I made video games. I wouldn't expect you to read all of this, but that's my name up there. So I was involved in scientific research and teaching. And actually, one of the things I did was protein structure determination. And in order to look at the models, the kind of chemical models, we used what were then considered to be exceptionally high-end graphics workstations, which were made by a company called Silicon Graphics. And that's kind of where I had the in to the job that I got at Rare. So I was Dr. Doak. I was Dr. Doak in a kind of academic world, and I ended up being Dr. Doak in a fairly non-academic world because of being the character in the game. So this is winding forward in my life to about 1995, I guess. And just to give you an insight into where all of this happened, the start of the GoldenEye game takes place in a dam, which is ostensibly set in Russia. But the actual dam is here. It's the Contra Dam. And funny, looking on Google Earth, it's incredible. You go on Google Earth, and there's actually a 3D model of this dam. When we were making GoldenEye, there were no 3D models of this dam, and some people spent a really long time building this thing polygon by polygon to include it in the game. Also now you can go to Contradam and for not very much money you can bungee jump off the top of it. and there's some great videos online of people leaping off it. Anyway, so that's another, and I suspect the reason that there's a 3D model of this on Google Earth is because of GoldenEye. I bet other dams aren't so heavily represented. So, zooming back out, I'm kind of this is me with my world leader pretend moment when I was a little lad, and the place I found myself ending up was in the middle of nowhere, effectively in Leicestershire, in the UK, which is where Rare was situated. So Twycross is kind of famous for two things, I suppose. One is the Twycross Zoo, where the kind of chimpanzees and other primates are. And then this is the town of Twycross. And down the road running down through there is the A444. And on the south part, just as we're zooming in here, there's this area here, which is the old, it was called Manor Farmhouse, and that is where Rare headquarters was. So there's a kind of walk around there, grounds that you drove in, and then here, when I looked at this from Google Earth, I thought I'm going to be able to go back and find an image from maybe the mid-1990s. Unfortunately, there wasn't one, because that nondescript asphalt kind of tarmac bit in the middle, if you'd gone there, so 20 years ago, that would have been completely jammed full of cars. It was one of the interesting things about Rare was when I was there, I had this really crappy old Ford Fiesta. You had to park your kind of crappy car beside all kinds of Ferraris and Lamborghinis and stuff and things, and sometimes reverse it back through narrow spaces. And in here, the buildings at Rare were divided up into teams. So that barn there is where Donkey Kong was made, and this is GoldenEye. And GoldenEye Blast Core was there as well at one point. And again, with the marvels of the modern world, we can go down and zoom in. And here, with no blue plaque on the wall or anything to indicate what happened on here at all, that building that we're looking at there, I think I'll move along a little bit on the road, was where GoldenEye was made, just over there. And now it's got a little sign that says guard dogs. It's pretty much left alone. I think that the Stampers still own Manor Farm, but Rare isn't there anymore. Rare moved down further toward Nuneaton to a purpose-built site further down the road. So this is a picture of Manor Farmhouse from pretty much that era. One of the things that the Stampers did, which kind of really put them on the map, was that they reverse engineered the NES. So consoles are generally, certainly console or cartridge consoles are very closed systems. And that's always been from the start, because effectively the first party, whether it be Sony or Microsoft or Nintendo or Sega at that time, you're making a market that you then sell into. So it's got to be a market that you control. So the only way to get software onto the NES was to have Nintendo development kits and to have Nintendo approve and manufacture your software. Chris, I think, was probably the person behind it because he was more of the technical person, reverse engineered it. So they basically, along with a chap who they used to work with in the States, because they were working on arcade machines, went to Kyoto and showed Nintendo a NES game that they'd made. And that could have gone one of two ways. The way that it went was Nintendo said, well, that's really good, but can you stop doing it unless you come and do it with us? And Nintendo invested in Rare. About that time, there weren't many. I think the Darling brothers at Codemasters were also working with Nintendo, but it was a really big thing for Rare because it put them on a footing where they effectively became a kind of second-party developer. And all through the late 80s and into the kind of N64 era, they made an enormous number of games, which were mostly kind of, I don't know, kind of like potboiler games for the NES. But having kind of put that work in toward the end of the Super NES years, Rare was funded by Nintendo with a lot of research and development money, which went into machines like this machine. So this is just the monitor you see here at the moment. I think this is actually a picture from Tim Stamper's archive, and that's a Silicon Graphics monitor. And Silicon Graphics, this is from a time when there effectively was no 3D graphics on the desktop. I mean, it was kind of Windows, I guess Windows 95 and stuff and things. Anyone who was in PC gaming at that time, they were starting to buy accelerated 3D cards. This is a Silicon Graphics machine. They were really, really expensive. I think this probably is about, I don't know, 70 grand's worth of machine. But they went up to multi-million prices. And what Silicon Graphics were doing was making hardware accelerated 3D graphics engines. And first of all, they got involved with Nintendo and Rare with rendering, kind of like, so if you go back to Donkey Kong Country, kind of changed everyone's opinion of what sprite-based graphics could be. So up until then, it was all pixel hand-rendered stuff. And at Rare, they started to render these 3D models, which were rendered on machines like that Challenge XL. I think the list price was close to $1 million. And I think when I was there, the yearly maintenance, which was just the kind of insurance policy, if in case the thing fell over, was $100,000. And it was an incredibly brittle machine. It used to crash all the time. Behind it, there's like a big rack of about 24 processor boards. And that was what was used for the rendering. It's called the Death Star. At Rare, all the machines had these kind of like sci-fi names. And this is kind of a Rare promotional brochure from, it was kind of, when they were recruiting for people in the move from Super Nintendo to N64. So it's showing off this was the highest end offline rendered graphics you could have at the time. So there's Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong at the bottom. And this brochure is a thing that I haven't been given it when I went to go for interview at Rare. In the time I was there, I can't remember them doing anything quite so public-facing in terms of self-promotion. But it's basically a recruitment brochure for Rare, very heavily produced and showing you certain graphics machines, rendering, resources, where the company came from. And then at the bottom here, you see this thing, the Nintendo Ultra 64. So this was early 90s. And the console transition from one generation to the next generation is always a very fraught time for companies because you have a monopoly existing in the console you have. You need to shift a whole bunch of units to the new console, and you need people to follow and buy the software for that. And every generational shift I've seen and been involved with in consoles, there's always some gimmick. So at this stage, the gimmick was 3D because nobody did real-time 3D before. If you can wind forward to, say, the PlayStation 2, when I was involved in that was like the DVD was a big thing in that because people didn't have DVD players. The next generation, it was pretty much online all the time. And then the Xbox had the disk drive and stuff. So there's always something. But at this point, it was 3D graphics. Okay, so Ultra 64. I'm going to show you the internet's great because you can find all these things on the internet now. So this is a video from Nintendo and Silicon Graphics promoting the Ultra 64. This is so dated, but it's quite funny.
The future, tomorrow begins today. Nintendo, the world's leader in video games, has joined forces with Silicon Graphics, the world's leader in visual computing, to introduce the most exhilarating, breathtakingly realistic 3D video entertainment ever witnessed. Project Reality. Leagues beyond any currently available or anticipated hardware, Project Reality will bring to home video players the same types of astounding visual effects seen in movies, like Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park.
Interestingly, like many hardware and software engineering projects, the Silicon Graphics delivery of the N64 was fraught with all kinds of just developmental problems. The other thing that had happened from Nintendo's point of view was that one of the companies who they had sought to partner with at the back end of the Super Nintendo was Sony. So Nintendo, there's a famous hybrid which has now been kind of unearthed, and if you look on the internet, you can see pictures of it. People have got it working again, which was this kind of thing. It was a CD-ROM drive which the Super Nintendo docked to, and they were going to work together and make a new console, which was going to be CD-based, and that was going to be Nintendo's next thing. Unfortunately, they fell out. So Sony kind of went off in a huff about the whole thing, and Nintendo went off in a huff. The effort Sony had put into it ultimately became the PlayStation 1. And Nintendo then partnered with Silicon Graphics. And again, at that time, everyone's trying to make a case for why their machine is better than the others. Now, this is an extraordinary advert. So this is from, I think, 1995. And this is Nintendo missing the date that they were going to deliver their N64, which was still called the Ultra 64 at that point in time, and basically saying, here's a machine you can't buy. So can you wait? Critically, can you wait until after Christmas, which is just insane. And if you look at the bottom, a lot of it's kind of pitched against. So 32-bit CD machines are fine, but they don't cut it where it really counts. They don't have the processing power. The thing that not CD slow. So Nintendo, despite the fact that they had been pretty much in bed with Sony and were going to make a CD-based games console, it just had to backpedal enormously. The one thing that they did have in their favor, and Nintendo have always had in their favor, is that their first-party development is insanely good. And the game, which launched with the N64 when it came out, which you can see this is now called the N64, was Super Mario, which, I mean, to my mind, it's pretty unsurpassed in terms of redefining what people expected games to be. If you can remember back to your first experience of it, at that time it was like, well, it's like a cartoon, but you're in the cartoon, which was transformative. So they were making these excuses about the thing being late, and but meanwhile, back at Rare, does anyone know what this is? It's the GoldenEye duck. So Ian Fleming was a bit of a twitcher. He's the kind of person who'd be very at home up in Clyde Marshes, up on the Norfolk coast, because he absolutely loved bird watching. And his Jamaican kind of hideaway was named after a bird. It was called GoldenEye. So when the GoldenEye film was being made, I think it was the first Bond film which wasn't directly based on a Fleming novel. So it's a new story. And I mean, cleverly in terms of branding, as you know, if you go back to that clip with Auric Goldfinger, you know, gold and Bond, it's always been a kind of glamorous thing. So the name came from this, and GoldenEye was the game. So this is about 1995, 96. I'm at Rare. I joined Rare to be the person who looked after those Silicon Graphics machines. That was my in. So I was working, doing research and playing with Silicon Graphics machines, and reading Edge magazine, which was the kind of like the highbrow video game magazine at the time. And it had this advert that was saying Rare are looking for a system administrator to look after the Silicon Graphics machines. So I went there, applied for the job, kind of thinking I wouldn't get it. And funny, going back, talking to the people who employed me, they said I came, and they're going, Christ, he won't come here because he's got an academic career. Why would he want to do this? But what I didn't realise was that I was probably one of the few people in the UK at the time who ran a Silicon Graphics network. So we had at our exceptionally well-funded Oxford University interdisciplinary research facility, we had across the site probably about 10 Silicon Graphics machines. Rare, in their little farmhouse, had about 80 or 90. Funded again by Kyoto coming out of NCL in Japan. So I was working GoldenEye. The game was, Nintendo had picked up the GoldenEye license, picked up the Bond license. It was a thing. It's all a bit murky as to how it kind of came about, but I think as far as Martin Hollis was team leader on GoldenEye. Martin relates it as saying that they had this license, and the idea was that maybe there would be a Super Nintendo platforming game with pre-rendered graphics a la Donkey Kong that was a Bond game with Bond kind of boinking along and doing little forward rolls and stuff and things. And that was kind of what they were going to do. nobody at Rare on the kind of Donkey Kong team, I think, wanted to have anything to do with it. So it was kind of like it was it was floating around. And Martin had been employed to work on some of the low-level kind of coding and development on the N64, and had worked on Killer Instinct and Killer Instinct Arcade. And as he recalls it, he just one day said to Tim, is anyone doing anything with that? He says, because I like Bond. Tim said, well, do you want to run it? Yeah. Well, can you write a pitch for it? And the pitch was that it would be a bit like Virtua Cop. So Virtua Cop, the kind of Sega coin-op, and then later on Saturn and stuff. So a scripted camera with a light gun, except the N64 didn't have a light gun. So they basically were building this thing, and this Martin says that this probably is dated wrong. It's really funny. This is the GoldenEye design document. Interestingly, it's got these are the levels. This design document I didn't see until about 2015, because Martin had it somewhere, and that's a thing about GoldenEye. It was built by a very organic, iterative process. And if I have one thing to say about making games, that's the way to make games. And anyone who tells you otherwise is wrong. Yes, you can plan things, but the real magic happens when you have something which works and runs, and you just iterate the hell out of it. And if you look at the other companies who in recent years have been championed for being the most amazing developers, I'm particularly thinking of the kind of pedestal that Valve is held on. Valve just keeps things and iterates on them behind the scenes and doesn't really release them until they're ready. Now, strangely, GoldenEye ended up being a thing that kind of, because it missed the movie, because the N64 missed the movie, because nobody expected it to be any good, because it wasn't really the A-team at Rare, it was a bunch of new guys making a thing, we were actually afforded an enormous amount of insulation from any kind of pressure. I mean, at the time, looking back, we thought we were under pressure a lot, but nobody was coming in and saying, you're going to be fired if you don't get this done. It was kind of like, just keep, they knew we were working hard, but there wasn't really a development schedule for it. So this now is, unfortunately, there's very little primary source information. We didn't record what we were doing. It wasn't like development now, where if somebody's working on a AAA thing, they're also working on the documentary and the coffee table book at the same time. We were just some people making something. This is the ducts, maybe. Can you see the texture there? That's quite interesting. That texture is tiny. The ROM on GoldenEye was only about 10 megs, so compressed. So it was really, really small stuff. Often the texturing was done with intensity alpha textures, so grayscale textures. So this is the gas plant. And these are the kind of levels that Carl was building. So the levels were kind of often built with no idea as to how the game would play in them. Carl was an architect, and he just built spaces with some reference to the film. I mean, interestingly on here, if you look on here, you can see the kind of the shading. You see it's highly repetitive for a start, but also things like the shading on the floor. These lines, the polygons are cut. The shadows are cut into the geometry because that was the cheapest way and the only way actually to do it. But when I came to be setting these levels up, the level would be pre-built, and we kind of had the idea for what the story might be, but it was a matter of just trying to shoehorn it in. And again, very, very organic and iterative, and you would build it and play it and look for problems and refine, iterate. This is the gas plant room. So again, there were things that had to happen. This room had to have a confrontation with Oyromov, the Russian colonel. Another one of these. This is quite interesting. This is just the texture set from GoldenEye. I'll scroll through this a bit, but basically it's lots of really low-res textures And then famously, we all had our heads in there. So here are some of the people on the team. That's Graham Norgate and Grant Kirkhope. There's Carl Hilton there, and then other people from Rare, Mark Edmonds, and Grace Jones, who obviously didn't work at Rare, but we were. That's another thing about GoldenEye. The license was like a license to use anything from the Bond universe, which is insane. So, that's like J.K. Rowling signing off and goes, well, if you want to do some complete Harry Potter mashup with all the Harry Potter stuff, and you can have all the likenesses of all the actors. We were allowed to pretty much do what we wanted. I think those are the particle effects and stuff and things. The really weird skateboard / kind of John Cleese Ministry of Funny Walks thing is Mark Edmonds. So Mark Edmonds was one of the, I would say there's 3 core programmers in GoldenEye. A fantastically talented and very private man. I mean, he's not really spoken much about it since then. And we were doing these things, and Mark didn't want to have his face on the monitors, so he did this silly walk, and then we put it on a skateboard for some reason. And if you look in GoldenEye, it's on one of the monitors when you go around. So again, it's funny, at one point when we were well behind schedule, well, in as much as a schedule existed, I remember Tim Stamper getting us all into the office once and saying, this is kind of important. It's not like some student project where it doesn't matter whether you get it done or not. And I guess some of the things we were doing were a bit like a student project where we didn't really have any consequences. Here, these pictures here are the 4 Bonds. I'll come back to that in a moment. And we didn't do much kind of formal design work on it. This is my working document from setting up the depot level. You can see it's a whole bunch of gobbledygook, but it's basically, all these markers are markers I've put in the world to run things off and kind of spawn guards and stuff and things like that. But we did communicate with each other a lot through paper. So this map would have been drawn by Carl. I can tell it's Carl. I can tell his writing up in the corner. Here's one for the water caverns level, which Duncan designed and built that level. But then, interestingly, he didn't set it up. He designed and built it, but by the time we came to doing the setup, I set it up because Duncan was doing the multiplayer at the time. So I didn't actually have his original idea for how that level would play out. And again, that level, you're kind of pursuing Trevelyan and stuff and things. This is some stuff from the dam. This is, again, interesting because it's got Bond Start written down here, but that's not where Bond Start is because we built another bit onto the level. Also, that's Carl's map, which a few years ago, Martin gathered a lot of information from us, and Carl had this version of it. I have this version of it, which is Carl's map, photocopied with me highlighting and writing stuff over the top. So, I mean, interestingly, for some of the levels that people think are some of the classic levels, like the Seven Eye interior, the frigate people like a lot, and the gas plant, there isn't a document like this because I probably set it up in the world and didn't have a planning stage. Again, a lot of stuff. This is stuff about portals, which are to do with the rendering and things. And this is the only schedule I ever had, and it was made by someone else at Rare. They were starting to worry that we were never going to get it done. And I think this was based on someone saying, well, how long do you think it would take to set up a level if you had all of the components in place to set up the level? And I said, probably 3 days. 3 days, just to be clear, 3 days, that's 3 days where the day is like a 14-hour day, because that's what we were working at. On the back end of GoldenEye, pretty much everyone on the team was pulling 100-hour weeks non-stop, which is illegal now. But again, another principle of game design, which you may or may not be aware of, is if you follow the graph goes, it's crap, 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 it's crap. It's really good. And it's even more than 80-20. All of the refinement and iteration and polish and what makes the fun, finding the fun in a game, in my experience, only happens at the back end. And then you're kind of like, I mean, everyone will have had that nightmare of, when you're doing an exam and it's like, finish the sentence you're writing and hand it in. Back end of GoldenEye, there were a few kind of things which were changing. We had to tone some of the violence down, but not much. Some of the animations were a little bit long, and maybe people dying and taking a long time to die. This is one of the guns in GoldenEye. It's a Scorpion SMG. And someone came and told us, well, actually, it is a Scorpion SMG, so you best not call it that, because the people who make them and the people who make M16s and the people who make Colt revolvers all will be wanting money. This is Ken Lobb, who is a great guy. He's still very active in the gaming world. He's at Microsoft now. And he was kind of our liaison man at Nintendo of America. And Ken used to come and see us maybe once every month, couple of months or whatever. This is Rosa Klebb. Ken Lobb, Rosa Klebb. So we called the gun the Klob. This is some fan art. The Klob famously doesn't shoot straight, so we tried to differentiate the guns. And I always had a lot of fun with Ken. So I remember one of the things was Ken was going, "Oh, you guys, you named a gun after me." So yeah, well, Ken, that's the good news. The bad news is it's named after you because it's loud and inaccurate. Anyway. So this is kind of finishing off the game. This is a hastily put together design for what the front end might look like, because we kind of got to the stage where somebody said, "Have you done the front end?" And everyone's going, "Oh, what do you mean?" It's like, "Well, the bit that does all the save filing and the picking." It's like, "Oh, okay, right, well, we probably need to do that." So again, lots of back-ended stuff. And one of the things that was on the front end, this is not Nintendo 64 resolution, this is ripped out of a ROM and probably redone. We had all the bonds. Because for us, a really important thing, if you're going to have a multiplayer game where you can be all the James Bonds, that's what you want, because I might think Roger Moore is the best Bond, you might think it's Sean Connery, somebody might think it's Dalton, somebody might think it's the new boy, as he was then, Brosnan, and you could play deathmatch, and you could sort it out. MGM came and said, "No, Sean Connery will want money." And probably the rest, if the rest of them find out Sean Connery's getting money, then they'll all want money as well, and it's just going to cost a lot. So we took them out. The last night we had them in the ROM as playable. We played a first to 100 deathmatch. I think it was me and Duncan and Martin and Mark, and I think Mark won as Roger Moore, rest in peace, by one point. And they used to be in there. And in fact, you could play through, not only could you play them in multiplayer, you could play through the mission. You could be Sean Connery in GoldenEye and play through the whole game because the heads were all interchangeable. This is interesting. I don't recommend doing this if you're in game development anymore. This is, again, somebody has done some archaeology and pulled this out. On the right-hand side, those are the grayscale ones are the alpha intensity, or just intensity textures for the Aztec level. And then someone has done some archaeology and realized that Carl just scanned them out of some coffee table book. So there was no rights clearance on those, but the people who owned the book never found out, so maybe they'll find out now. It's not my problem. Here's some more flagrant abuse of other people's digital rights. So this is Martin, just I don't know, just for the hell of it, at the back end going, "Oh, it'd be funny if we ripped off the BBFC thing." And also Martin, two things. So I'm in GoldenEye as Dr. Doak in the gas plant. And the reason I'm in GoldenEye as Dr. Doak in the gas plant is I was doing a level setup. We all had our characters modelled on us in the game. And as a joke, for the benefit of the team on that particular day, I put myself in, because we were making up, there's a lot of things in GoldenEye which were very innovative. There's a lot of kind of just your average recycling of ideas. So Dr. Doak in the gas plant is basically it's a key and a door thing. He might as well be a blue key and have a blue door. It's just you just have to meet him, and then he gives you the key, and then you can unlock the door. But that's all it is. But it's kind of jazzed up to have a bit of narrative in it. For the benefit of the team, for a laugh, I put myself in, and expecting to have to take it out because at Rare. One of the things the stampers were very keen on was on Rare being a very kind of monolithic thing. It was a brand. It wasn't a place where individuals worked. And in a way, I mean, something like Pixar is a bit the same. You'll know who Lasseter is, and you'll know who the top guys are, Catmull and people, but you don't know the names of all the people who are the technical directors at Pixar, or the people who do a lot of the work. So Tim saw this Dr. Doak in the thing and just said, okay, right, that comes out now. So it was taken out. But kind of because it had annoyed him, Martin put it back in again later. And also we kind of, I think we chose our timing in that when it went in, it had actually gone through localization and stuff. So when he saw it again later and said, okay, that's back in, it needs taken out, we could say, well, the guys at Nintendo could be really annoyed if they have to relocalize this. And it's like, it might create bugs. So I snuck myself in as Dr. Doak, and Martin signed the front of the bloody cartridge. So this is when you boot GoldenEye up, it has Martin's signature on the front. It's also got James Bond, which is Martin. I think Martin wrote James Bond with his left hand. So very high production values. This is fun. This is how. So now this is the date, and the corner of this is June 22nd, 97. So this is actually, I think at this point the game was pretty much done. We were bug fixing, and also we went to E3 that year, so we were allowed out of Rare because we weren't holding it up by not being there. And this is some bugs. I won't go into the details of it, but it's to do with GoldenEye. For those of you who know anything about coding, GoldenEye was entirely written in C. So it was highly performant and kind of pretty much down to the bleeding edge of the hardware. But it made, in C you can do a lot of fast and dangerous stuff. And GoldenEye is pretty much made up of lots of fast and dangerous stuff. But the bugs used to come on faxes, like this. And Martin we'd sit down in the morning and we'd divide them all up, and he'd read them out, and I'd go, I know what that is, or somebody would go, I know what that is, and then we'd fix them. But that was how it was done. There was no database for it. I mean, I think at NOA they kept them on probably on Excel or something. This is a lovely, lovely picture from probably a little bit later, maybe not, actually, maybe before E3. This is the GoldenEye team. Mr. Terasaki and Martin and I got on really well because we all smoked. And and it was quite funny at Rare because you weren't really allowed to smoke on the premises at all. So in order to smoke, Martin and I would go through that little gate that you saw at the beginning with the kind of warning, no entry, and cross the A444 on this fairly blind corner, and then walk past the churchyard on the other side to smoke in this field. And management were really disparaging about the whole idea. And in fact, Martin, I think, was the only person, apart from the stampers, who had a key to that door because he'd wangled it somehow. So it was really frowned upon. But then Mr. Terasaki came, and first day he's there, he's got a pack of cigarettes in his pocket, and he just wants to smoke a cigarette because that's what he did all the time. So we were allowed to go and take Mr. Terasaki out for cigarette breaks. Lovely, lovely guy. And in this picture, I remember Martin showing me this picture. I have no idea why he's crouching and why I'm crouching. And I remember what happened is that you're taking the picture, and like any kind of, English group picture, it's like, put the big guys like Mark at the back, little guys at the front. Oh, at the front. And Mr. Terasaki is thinking, okay, I must crouch because someone's telling me to crouch. And Martin, because Martin was kind of, he's laughing, he was feeling a bit embarrassed for him because he had crouched. In order to cover up the misunderstanding, Martin is crouching as well. So I really love this picture just because it was a really happy time. Kenji, I met him a few years later. His job after GoldenEye was the tricky business of working out how to translate Pokemon to the States. So if you look him up on Moby Games or anything, he's got an enormous number of credits which are all the Pokemon games, because he was kind of like one of the marketing brains behind how they would do all of that. So those guys did the Japanese localization. The game launched in Japan, I think, well, first it was like kind of August or something. Can't remember. This is interesting because it's the Japanese cartridge had a kind of things like this inside. This is a control explaining. I love these things because you don't get them anymore. Nobody makes them anymore. There was a lot of concern about whether people would be able to control Bond, particularly in Japan, where there wasn't a tradition of playing first-person shooters like Doom and Quake, as it was at that time. So if you look at the bottom, it's got this little thing, just so you know that your stick moves him forward and turns him. One of the things about GoldenEye, which is aged quite badly, is the control method. Believe you me, we tried every control method, but on the stick, because there's only one analog stick, and in the first-person game, you've got 4 axes to control. You've got 2 rotation axes and 2 translation axes. Now, in a dual analog setup, they're split, so the translation is on the left and the look is on the right. Because we only had one analog stick, we've got the one translation and one rotation, which makes it, when people try and play it now, they just end up looking at the floor all the time and looking at the walls and stuff. But it was necessary at the time to do it that way. And also, a thing from NCL was that they wanted it to be that you could play the game without having to do the look. So you could get Bond. If you play GoldenEye, particularly on low difficulty, you can pretty much go through the whole game without doing the strafing, because they really didn't like the idea that you'd circle strafe, because they felt it was difficult to do. So, the box. For those of you who don't know this, you're going to, well, I'm going to permanently change your opinion of this box art. Some of you are already sniggering. I don't understand how nobody picked this up, but if you look at Pierce Brosnan's face in that, it looks ridiculous. So the hand obviously looks like it's become part of his face. So there you go, that's what Pierce Brosnan actually looks like. Yeah. This is E397. And one of the things which is it really kind of came back to me a few weeks ago, I was at a retro gaming convention in Norway, is just how phenomenally important Rare was to Nintendo in 1997. So N64 had launched. They were on the back foot because it was late. It had limited software, so it had Mario had come out, but there was nothing else on the horizon out of NCL, so no first-party stuff. The other third-party stuff, things like Turok and Cruisin' USA, or the Midway thing, a lot, and there was a Star Wars game, a first-person Star Wars game, were not very good. And all of the games that were in time for Christmas 1997 were Rare games. So this is the front of the Nintendo stand. The blue monitors are GoldenEye running on a loop. The big standees are Mumbo from Banjo-Kazooie. There's a Banjo-Kazooie banner there. There's Conker's Quest. It's got Banjo and Fulgore, so all Rare characters on the big standees. Conker's Quest, this is great. This is Conker before he became a really sweary squirrel. So Conker's Quest was pretty much a Mario 64 ripoff with this really cute little squirrel who just used to jump around going, "Hi, I'm Conker!" Any of you who have actually played the actual Conker's Quest or Conker's Bad Fur Day will know that that was just an amazing kind of turnabout and largely down to Chris Seaver, who's a very good friend and a very sweary man. He basically is Conker. If you ever meet Chris Seaver, he is Conker. If you've got a stomach for it, you should go online, and there's a really good Conker commentary done by Chris Seaver and Sean Pyle. And it's basically, you can hear them, they're drinking and swearing all the way through it. But it's got lots of insights into the development. This is the GoldenEye stand. Interestingly, the game was pretty much finished. And we had a number of screens it was playable at, and that's Carl and Mark and B. And the first couple of days of the show, it was complete tumbleweed. Nobody came to see it at all. And then it started to pick up. Happier faces. Love that picture. And more people came to the stand. And again, you see there's Mario in the front there. The game ended up generating a buzz then. But actually, when it came out, it didn't have a lot of big sales out of the gate. This is also from Nintendo. This is. I love this picture. This is Martin Hollis on the left and Greg Mayles on the right. So Greg has been at Rare forever. He's a very, very good game designer. At the moment, I know what he's doing at the moment. He's trying to get the Sea of Thieves thing finished, whatever it is. Really funny. At Rare, they wanted to make a pirate game forever. They've always wanted to make a pirate game. Always. Then they ended up making Kinect Sports and all kinds of other stuff that they hated doing. But now they're getting to make a pirate game. So whenever you see those guys with the dev diaries and stuff, they really are completely hyper excited about making a pirate game. That's the coolest picture I have of us smoking. Pretty much that's that E3, and we're pretty knackered because we've been demoing the game and stuff and things. This is from a year later. I have very few pictures from inside Rare because you weren't really allowed to take pictures of what was going on in there. But this is 98, so this is when we were making Perfect Dark. But pretty much the same desks and environment. This is Carl. And this is in that GoldenEye block. This is Graham Norgate, and in the front is Chris Seaver. This is a typical slacking off kind of episode. I remember there used to be a live room, which was this kind of like acoustically shielded room beside Graham's, and it was a really good place to go and hide. It was a really small room, but nobody would dare open the door in case you were recording. So we used to go and hide there, and sometimes just stand and shout and swear. This is Martin's desk, 1998. We were about to go to E3 again. The monitor at the bottom has got Perfect Dark on it. Obviously, GoldenEye poster up there. The thing below the GoldenEye poster is a John Woo poster. We used to love John Woo. And a lot of stuff in GoldenEye is John Woo inspired. I mean, just the whole, everything explodes. You know, you can't fire it, and if you're going to fire a gun, you fire your gun like this, you do all that. And that whole, personal bugbear. Later, Halo came along, and suddenly having two guns was some kind of branding thing, like dual wielding. And we was going, well, we did it 5 years ago. It was called double guns. But that's complete John Woo. And this is my desk. Teletubbies there. I was a big fan of Teletubbies. That was a Teletubbies kids play thing. You could move the Teletubbies around and stick them on there and do obscene things with them. Very popular. and the crazy train. I forgot what can you see the crazy train? You know, the flip track crazy train. Bond standee in the corner with a hairnet on and a toilet roll on his gun. This is me before they took the BAFTA away from me. Never got my hands on that again. The Oscar isn't actually an Oscar. It was an award from some lads kind of big screen TV thing. And I particularly remember it because I had to go to Soho, to this really seedy place, to get this. And they had this kind of glamour model who gave it to me, gave me a big hug. And she was called Theresa May. So look it up. There is another Theresa May. She was a glamour model. Martin looking really pissed off because we've just come back from E3 and it's really important to fill out all of your expense claims for taxi fares. So you had to get taxi everywhere. So he's got a whole bunch of taxi receipts and he's filling them into a spreadsheet. Okay, a year later, so the game came out. It was a big success, a bigger success than anyone could have imagined. In 1998, GoldenEye at that E3 won all of the categories it was in. So it won 5 of these AIAS, catchy acronym, awards. This was supposed to be the Oscars for video games, but actually video games people aren't glamorous, so it's never really taken off. But it still goes. And there's us all again with a couple of members of the Perfect Dark team basking in the glory. Afterwards, it was interesting. I think GoldenEye. I mean, I obviously left Rare a year later. It was a hard thing for the Stampers, I think, because, as I said, they had this kind of monolithic way of portraying the company, and then part of the company had done this thing that was really, really successful, and kind of was really important to the N64, and also kind of redefined the first-person shooter. So people wanted to talk to us about it, and we would have these things. So here, this is, I think, from Edge. This is Edge magazine, Christmas '97. And our names are attributed in the article, which are certainly the initials, which is quite unusual. Martin. This is a kind of, this N64 magazine, pictures of us, da-di-da, da-di-da. This is me, looking bitchin' at E3 '98. I think the lady is supposed to be kind of, it's like my first Psycho Mantis cosplay. She's wearing a bin bag and a gas mask. Anyway, it was a very happy time. I'm quite pleased. I think there, yes, I've still got it. Rare very kindly gave everyone on the team one of those Amiga Seamaster watches. Okay, a couple of legacy things about GoldenEye just to wrap up. Everyone always asks, why is Oddjob in the game? Well, he's in the game because we were allowed to use all the characters. And then the next thing they ask is, well, why is he so short? And my answer used to be because he is short. And then someone pointed out to me that the guy wasn't really that short. But he's not actually short. Which obviously spawned this whole thing. So if you play as Oddjob, you're the cheater because you're cheating. And I think actually in our heads we had confused him slightly with Nick Nack. The pause button. So the pause button in GoldenEye is actually broken, really, isn't it? Because you press pause when you're getting all kinds of shit shot out of you and you're up against the wall and you're dying. And then when you're doing this, you get to get shot a bit more. Again, really strange, because I don't really understand why that wasn't eliminated when we were going through lot check at NCL, because it's just a bit strange. Baron Samdi. Again, because we were allowed to use all of the universe, we used Baron Samdi in the Aztec level. And for those of you who've played the game, I don't know how well you remember it, at the end of that level, in the closing cutscene, you've killed him 3 times, and he's definitely dead, and then you see Bond walking out of the Aztec level, and then Baron Samdi comes out and just stands and goes, "Mwah, mwah," and does this laugh, and he's not dead. One of the brilliant things about GoldenEye is that in the years since, people just unearthed things you can do in it, and people discovered that it is possible. It's possible to kill Baron Samdi. So if you get a whole bunch of proximity mines and place them in a big chain around where the final cutscene takes place, then when Bond walks off, this is Bond walking off, and then you get the reverse cut. So you can see that the mines are placed on the wall. And then Bond, because the game's still running even though you don't have any control, triggers one of these proximity mines. And then you get a domino chain going up with these things which have been placed really carefully, going around behind Sandy. And then he laughs. And they explode. It's just brilliant. And I mean, there's a bunch of other stuff like that, like with speed running and things, where people have found all these glitches in the game. It's just, I mean, it's phenomenal, the kind of the continuing life that it has had outside of what it was intended for. And then you've got things like this. This is the speed, to GoldenEye, I mean, educational. If on GoldenEye the controls forward and strafe obviously are at right angles to each other, but if you go on the 45-degree angle, you get, instead of, and GoldenEye, it's useful for teaching maths, you get root 2 instead of 1 or 1. So if you move diagonally in GoldenEye, you go at 1.4 times the top speed. So all the people who speedrun it go diagonally all the time. The other thing they do is that they look at the floor all the time, because if you look at the floor, the game doesn't have to render so much, and it runs ever so slightly faster. another thing about GoldenEye, which is kind of well known, I won't go into it much, but just to say, Steve Ellis and Duncan Botwood, but particularly Steve Ellis, who did all the coding, pretty much added the multiplayer mode very, very late in the development of the game. I mean, it was insane. It certainly wasn't really sanctioned by management, but that's become. I mean, for GoldenEye, that was the thing that really made it have legs, because it became the couch multiplayer game of choice for a whole generation, and. This is myself and David Wise a few weeks ago at this gaming convention in Norway, and I had people coming up all the time to have the game signed, and it was really, I mean, it was quite emotional at times, because there'd be people coming up and they would say, GoldenEye, that's an amazing game. And then the next thing they said was, I remember playing that with my brother or my uncle or somebody I don't see much or somebody who's dead or whatever, or I failed college because of your game, all that kind of stuff. Here's one example. This is a guy, Christian, who came up, and it's funny, I was getting a bit teary, because as you get older, you get a bit teary about things like this. That's his cartridge. And I said, oh, you're Christian. And he said, yeah. I'm sorry, it's not written very well because I was 9. I was going, well, that's brilliant, you know, and you want me to write my name beside your name on the, and it's like, you know, he's written his name there, and it's a bit like, that's like Andy and Toy Story. You know, that's him. That thing is so important to him that, you know, you wrote your name on it because you might go to your friend's house and somebody might take your cartridge home. So I've really enjoyed talking to people over the years when they come and tell me, you know, it's like something I did, or a group of us did, touched millions of people. I did this at Retrospin West. This took me a lot longer than it should have done. but anyway, for those of you of a certain age, that'll mean a lot. And what can you say? I mean, for me, Bond was Connery, but I mean, we were making the game. The number of sort of completely sleep-deprived hours we would spend kind of trying to get the game and doing ridiculous Sean Connery impressions and things. Anyway, so thank you for listening. I've probably run a bit over, but it's been a pleasure to kind of share my recollections of it with you. Thanks.